The morning sun rose over the quiet farmland, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber as Samuel Carter wiped the sweat from his brow. His hands were rough from years of tending soil, planting seeds, and harvesting crops that fed half the county. He wasn't rich, but he was proud. Proud of the acres he had turned from dust into life. Proud of the legacy passed down from his late father who taught him that dignity was worth more than any dollar. That morning, Samuel loaded the back of his old pickup truck with sacks of cash earnings from the recent harvest sale. It was a good season, better than most, and he was heading to the local bank to deposit it safely. He wore his cleanest overalls, a freshly ironed shirt, and his father's worn leather hat, the one that always made him feel a little taller. As he drove toward town, the wind rushed through the open window, carrying the scent of earth and cornfields, and with it came the quiet satisfaction of a man who had earned every cent with the sweat of his labor. When he arrived at the small brick bank on Main Street, he noticed how polished everything looked. The glass doors gleamed. The marble floors inside reflected light like mirrors, and the staff behind the counters moved briskly with rehearsed smiles. Samuel had been there before, though not often. He preferred to keep most of his money safe, at home, hidden in an old metal box, but this time the sum was too large to risk. He parked his truck, stepped inside, and waited his turn in line, holding the heavy envelope close to his chest. People glanced at him briefly, a farmer in dusty boots among neatly dressed townsfolk, but he ignored their looks. He had done nothing wrong. He was just there to do what any honest man would. When his turn came, the teller, a young woman with polite eyes, asked him to step over to the manager's desk since the deposit was quite large. The manager, a tall man with slicked back hair and a sharp suit, looked up from his computer screen with mild irritation. His nameplate read, Mr. Harold Whitman. Samuel approached with a respectful nod and placed the envelope on the desk. "Good morning, sir. I'd like to deposit this," he said, his voice steady but humble. The manager's eyes narrowed, scanning the farmer up and down before settling on the envelope. "And where did you get this kind of money?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Samuel blinked, surprised by the question. "From my harvest," he replied simply. "I sold my crops last week. Cash payment." Whitman smirked slightly, leaned back in his chair, and gave a dismissive chuckle. "Of course," he said, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "And you're telling me all this came from selling vegetables?" Samuel's grip on his hat tightened, but he stayed calm. "Corn and soybeans," he corrected, "and a little from livestock." The manager opened the envelope and started counting. His eyes widened when he realized how much it was, nearly $15,000. He looked up again, his expression twisting with suspicion. "You expect me to believe a farmer like you walks in with this kind of cash?" he said, louder now, drawing attention from nearby customers. Samuel felt a heat rising in his chest, not from guilt but from shame and disbelief that he was being treated like a criminal for his own earnings. "I've been working this land all my life," he said firmly. "Every dollar in that envelope came from honest work." The manager scoffed. "Sure it did," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "You people always have some story, don't you?" Then, in a shocking moment that froze everyone in the lobby, he tore the envelope open completely and flung the cash across the floor. Bills scattered in every direction, across the marble tiles, under chairs, fluttering near the feet of stunned customers. "There," he said coldly. "Pick it up. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to launder money in my bank." For a moment, the world went silent. Samuel just stood there, eyes locked on the pile of crumpled bills that represented months of backbreaking labor. His throat tightened as humiliation burned through him. Every gaze in the room felt like a dagger, some pitying, some judgmental, some pretending not to notice. He bent down slowly, gathering the scattered bills one by one with trembling hands. Each piece of paper seemed heavier than before, soaked not in dirt but in disgrace. The young teller watched, frozen in disbelief, her face pale with shock. Even the security guard shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Behind him, someone whispered, "That's just wrong." Another person muttered, "He didn't deserve that." But no one stepped forward. Not yet. Samuel's heart pounded in his ears as he picked up the last of the bills and tucked them back into the torn envelope. He wanted to walk out, to leave that place forever. But something inside him, perhaps the quiet pride inherited from his father, kept him standing tall. He straightened his back, met the manager's smug eyes, and said quietly, "You've no right to treat me like that." Whitman only smirked again, brushing imaginary dust off his suit. "I treat people based on what they bring into my bank," he said coldly. "And you brought dirt." Samuel clenched his jaw but said nothing more. He turned toward the door, his boots echoing on the marble floor, each step a mix of fury and heartbreak. He could feel dozens of eyes following him, some filled with shame, some with silent approval of what had just happened. The moment he reached the door, a voice called out softly behind him. It was the young teller. "Sir, wait," she said, but he didn't stop. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the sunlight, the same sunlight that had seemed so warm and golden that morning now felt sharp and cold against his skin. He stood by his truck, breathing heavily, the envelope clutched tightly in his fist. Inside the bank, murmurs began to rise. The teller who had witnessed everything turned to her colleague, whispering in disbelief. A few customers shook their heads, and one woman pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she replayed the video she had secretly recorded during the incident. Her camera had captured everything, from the moment Samuel approached the desk to the cruel act that followed. She looked at the footage in silence for a moment, then pressed upload. The clip began to circulate within minutes, spreading from one person to another until it reached far beyond that small town's walls. As Samuel sat in his truck outside the bank, his hands still shaking, the air around him seemed heavy with disbelief. He stared down at the torn envelope on the passenger seat, the wrinkled bills spilling from its edges like pieces of his dignity scattered on the floor. He had faced storms, droughts, and broken machinery, but nothing had ever made him feel so small as that single act of disrespect. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him, unaware that within those very minutes, something far bigger than his humiliation was already taking shape behind him. Inside the bank, a crowd had begun to gather near the manager's desk. The once quiet murmur of transactions and keyboard clicks was now replaced by angry whispers and the faint hum of cell phone cameras capturing the aftermath. The young woman who had recorded the scene earlier was talking to others, showing them the video. Each person who saw it reacted the same way, with wide eyes, shaking heads, and a kind of moral outrage that could not stay silent for long. The video spread first through local group chats, then onto social media platforms. It took only a few minutes before the comments began flooding in, people who knew Samuel, people who didn't, all reacting to what they saw as an act of pure cruelty. "This is disgusting," one comment read. "That man worked his whole life for that money." Another said, "Fire that manager now." By the time Samuel started his truck to drive away, his name was already trending locally. A friend from town called him, voice trembling with anger, asking if the rumors were true. Samuel didn't know what to say. He hadn't even realized someone had filmed it. He only knew that the pain still sat heavy in his chest, and he just wanted to go home, far away from the cold marble floors and judgmental stares of that bank. Back inside, Harold Whitman, the bank manager, had returned to his office, still smugly convinced he had done the right thing. He didn't yet know that his world was about to collapse in the span of an hour. His assistant knocked on his door nervously. "Sir," she said softly, "there's something you need to see." He waved her off at first, but she insisted, showing him her phone. The moment he saw his own face on the screen, tossing the farmer's money to the ground while a horrified crowd looked on, his stomach dropped. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "It's everywhere," she whispered. It's already on Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok. People are tagging the bank's main page. Whitman's face turned pale. He stood up abruptly, slamming his desk. "Take it down," he barked. "Get whoever posted it to remove it right now." But it was too late. Once something hit the internet with that kind of power, it couldn't be stopped. Within the hour, local news outlets picked up the story. Reporters started calling the bank for a statement. The video had struck a deep chord because it wasn't just about one man. It was about something bigger, something raw and real that had been buried under the surface for too long. Viewers saw not just Samuel, but every person who had ever been disrespected or judged because of how they looked, dressed, or came from. In towns across the state, people were sharing the clip, adding their own stories of unfair treatment. "That could have been my father," one man wrote. "That could have been me," said another. The comments were filled with anger, empathy, and an overwhelming demand for accountability. At the same time, the bank's corporate headquarters, located in a nearby city, was flooded with emails and calls. The PR team was in chaos, their inboxes overwhelmed with customer complaints threatening to close their accounts unless action was taken. The regional director, a composed woman named Linda Evans, was called in from a meeting to deal with the emergency. "It's blowing up faster than we can respond," one of her assistants said, showing her the trending hashtags. Linda watched the video in silence, her expression tightening as she reached the part where Whitman threw the money. "Get him on the phone," she said sharply. "Now." Back in the small-town branch, Whitman's phone rang. He hesitated before answering, already sensing who it might be. "Harold," Linda's voice came through, calm but cutting. "What in God's name did you do?" He stammered, trying to explain, saying something about suspicious behavior and protocol, but she wasn't having it. "Protocol?" she snapped. "Do you call humiliating a customer and throwing his money on the floor protocol?" The room felt suddenly small to him, the walls closing in. "Linda, it's not what it looks like," he tried, but she interrupted. "It's exactly what it looks like. You just made our bank the face of racial discrimination across the internet." Her voice dropped, colder now. "Pack up your things, Harold. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending termination." At that same moment, outside the branch, people had begun to gather. Samuel didn't even realize what was happening until a neighbor called him again. "Sam, turn on your phone," they said breathlessly. He unlocked it to find dozens of missed calls, notifications, and messages from friends and family. The video was everywhere. His face, his voice, his humiliation, all of it captured for the world to see. For a moment, he felt exposed, as if his private pain had been put on public display. But as he scrolled through the comments, something inside him shifted. People weren't mocking him. They were standing with him. Hundreds of strangers were calling him a man of dignity, a hard worker, the face of quiet strength. Others had even started raising awareness, demanding justice not just for him, but for everyone treated unjustly by those in power. Within 2 hours, the story reached regional news stations. Cameras arrived outside the bank, journalists setting up tripods, interviewing locals who had witnessed the event. One of them, the woman who had filmed the video, stepped forward and spoke about what she saw. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said to the microphone. "He just wanted to deposit his money." The manager humiliated him for no reason. It was cruel. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and viewers watching from home felt the truth in her tone. The footage played in loops on news channels, each replay fueling the outrage further. By late afternoon, the bank's corporate office released an official statement apologizing publicly to Samuel Carter. It condemned the manager's behavior and announced his immediate dismissal. The statement ended by promising a personal visit and restitution for what had happened. Samuel heard about it not through a phone call, but through a friend who texted him the link. He read it quietly, sitting in his farmhouse kitchen, the sunlight dimming outside as he looked at his reflection in the dark window. His name was suddenly known by thousands, but fame wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was that the truth had been seen. People had finally stood up, not because he asked them to, but because they recognized what was right. Meanwhile, at the bank, Harold Whitman was escorted out by security. The same people who had once greeted him with respect now avoided eye contact. Outside, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing as he walked quickly to his car. "Do you have anything to say to Mr. Carter?" One called out, but he stayed silent, slamming the door and driving off. Inside the branch, employees gathered around the teller who had first tried to stop him earlier, thanking her for speaking up. The tension in the air was thick, but there was also a quiet sense of relief. Justice, in some small way, had been served. As the day turned to night, the clip continued to spread, reaching millions across the country. People shared it not just to show outrage, but as a reminder of the simple truth Samuel had lived by his whole life, that no one, no matter how powerful or privileged, has the right to strip another person of their dignity. The next morning, Samuel woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. The rooster hadn't even crowed yet, but already his name was everywhere. On the news, social media, even radio talk shows discussing what had happened. For a man who had spent most of his life in quiet fields far from public attention, the sudden flood of messages and calls felt surreal. His niece from Atlanta called first, her voice trembling with both pride and anger. "Uncle Sam, you're on TV," she said. "Everyone's talking about you." He didn't know how to respond. Fame had never been part of his dreams. He just wanted fairness, respect, and the right to live with his head held high. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples, trying to understand how one moment of humiliation had turned into a movement that now seemed to have a life of its own. Outside, the morning mist still hung over the fields. The corn stalks shimmered under the rising sun, and for a moment, the world felt calm again. Samuel decided to take his truck and drive into town, not because he wanted to see the aftermath, but because he needed to face it. He couldn't hide from what had happened. As he drove down the long dirt road toward the main highway, he noticed something unusual. People he barely knew stood by the roadside waving at him, some raising a hand in silent support, others giving him small nods of respect. At the first gas station, a man came out from behind the counter and said, "You did nothing wrong, Mr. Carter. We're with you." It wasn't pity he saw in their eyes, it was solidarity. When he reached the town square, a crowd had already gathered outside the bank. There were news vans, reporters with microphones, and even a few community leaders speaking into cameras. Hand-painted signs read, "Justice for Samuel" and "Respect every worker." Samuel parked across the street, watching quietly from his truck. He hadn't asked for any of this, yet it had grown beyond him. It was no longer just about one man and one cruel act. It had become a story about every hard-working person who had been looked down upon for no reason other than prejudice or pride. A reporter spotted him and pointed, and soon cameras began turning his way. The crowd parted as he stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. Someone clapped, then another, and soon the whole crowd was applauding. Samuel felt his chest tighten as he approached the steps of the bank, now flanked by police officers and corporate representatives. Among them was Linda Evans, the regional director who had fired Whitman the day before. She walked down to meet him, her expression a mixture of professionalism and remorse. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, extending her hand, "I came here to offer a personal apology on behalf of the bank. What happened was unacceptable, and I assure you that man no longer works for us." Samuel hesitated, then shook her hand. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm not here for revenge. I just want to be treated like any other man." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The cameras caught every second, broadcasting it live to thousands of viewers who felt the sincerity in his tone. Linda nodded. "You have my word, Mr. Carter," she replied. "We've launched an internal review, and we're setting up community outreach programs to rebuild trust." She gestured toward the doors. "If you'd allow us, we'd like to process your deposit properly today." The crowd watched as Samuel stepped back into the same bank where his dignity had been trampled less than 24 hours earlier. The marble floors gleamed as before, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. Employees stood straighter, eyes filled with remorse. The same teller who had watched helplessly the previous day now came forward, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said softly. "You didn't deserve that." Samuel nodded kindly. "It's all right, miss," he said. "What matters is what we learn from it." He placed the same envelope, repaired with tape this time, on the counter. The teller handled it with care, counting each bill respectfully before issuing a receipt. When she handed it back to him, the entire branch seemed to exhale, as if a long, dark cloud had finally lifted. Outside, the applause started again. Cameras flashed. Samuel didn't say much. He wasn't one for speeches. But when a reporter asked him what message he wanted to share with the world, he paused for a moment before answering. "Dignity isn't something a man earns from others," he said. "It's something he carries within himself. But sometimes, the world needs a reminder to see it." That quote spread almost as fast as the video had. People began sharing it online, printing it on posters, even turning it into hashtags. Across the country, discussions about workplace discrimination, respect, and equality began to rise again, sparked by one farmer's quiet strength. Churches held gatherings, schools discussed it in classrooms, and social activists praised Samuel for handling everything with grace instead of anger. He became a symbol, not because he fought back with rage, but because he stood his ground with quiet dignity. A few days later, Samuel received an unexpected visit at his farm. Linda Evans returned, this time accompanied by a few members of the corporate board. They brought a letter of formal apology, a compensation check, and an offer to establish a new fund in his name, the Carter Community Trust, to support local farmers and small business owners. Samuel listened politely, though he wasn't sure what to make of it. He didn't want money for what had happened. No amount could erase the sting of that moment. But the idea of helping others in his community, that spoke to him. "If this helps folks like me get treated fairly," he said, "then I'm on board." The deal was signed that afternoon, and by evening the news had spread again. Meanwhile, the former manager, Harold Whitman, had vanished from public sight. Rumors swirled about him, losing not just his job, but his reputation entirely. Some said he tried to apologize privately, but Samuel never received any message, and perhaps that was for the best. There were things an apology couldn't mend. What Samuel found instead was peace. A quiet kind that came not from revenge, but from knowing he had stood his ground without losing himself. In the weeks that followed, the Carter Community Trust began providing small loans and grants to struggling farmers, especially those from marginalized backgrounds who had faced similar discrimination. Samuel became something of a local hero, though he never called himself one. He still rose at dawn, still worked the fields, still waved to his neighbors from his old pickup truck. The only difference was that now, when people looked at him, they didn't just see a farmer, they saw a man who reminded the world what respect truly meant. One evening, as he walked through his fields, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink. Samuel paused and took off his hat, letting the breeze brush against his face. The crops swayed gently, whispering in the wind, and he thought about how life could turn cruelty into compassion if people were willing to open their eyes. The memory of that day at the bank still lingered, but it no longer hurt the way it once had. It had become a story that lived beyond him, one that taught others the value of humility, justice, and the power of truth when it's seen in the light of day.